Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar which is looking at the government's response to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. We are here today as the Act on IICSA campaign group, which is hosted by the Survivors Trust and thankfully supported by Swatowski's solicitors today to make this event happen, so thank you very much. We have a fantastic panel for you. You won't find a group that know more about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse than our speakers today. Unfortunately, Fay Maxted, our CEO of the Survivors Trust, is unable to join us due to illness, but we still have David, Alexis and John, who I will introduce you to in a minute. The Act on IICSA campaign group, that's our core steering group, and we're also very gratefully supported by many people from the charity sector, including Guildford Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Services, Seen and Heard, Survive, Jewish Sexual Abuse Survivors, Survivors of Abuse, Mankind. And if anybody else would like to come and get more involved with Act on IICSA, do please get in touch afterwards. We know there's been a lot in the press about sexual violence again this week. Particularly, there's been lots of talk about child sexual exploitation with the announcement of another grooming gangs inquiry. I use grooming gangs very loosely. There is no such definition as the term grooming gangs. We are talking about organised networks of men who are choosing to sexually abuse children. We need to be really careful with our language and make sure we're calling it out for what it is. There's a big question because, as we know, Louise Casey, and thank you very much to Louise for her fantastic work and absolutely brilliant report that was released 2 days ago. She originally didn't want another inquiry. We are now 978 days after the publication of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. It made 20 key recommendations. In that time, we only have 3 in train. They haven't even actually been implemented yet. We just have 3 that will be. That, I think we can all agree, is a pretty shameful statistic. Having done this, and I think I speak for many of my colleagues in the sector, frankly, our patience is wearing out. It's wearing very thin. I think that if we had those recommendations implemented, perhaps Baroness Casey might be having a different conversation with us all. Having said that, extend huge thanks to Baroness Casey's team and, of course, the IICSA team, which at its peak was 180 staff. It ran for 8 years. It heard over 379 days of hearings and investigations, and it spoke to 7,500 victims. We cannot ignore its recommendations. We're letting down society, we're letting down the taxpayers, and we're letting down those survivors. And so that is what we are here to discuss today. We have put together a progress table. Those of you online have been sent this. It's the 20 recommendations, and it tells you which ones are in train, which ones have been discussed but no action has been taken, and which ones, despite Yvette Cooper just on Tuesday this week saying that she will be implementing all of these recommendations, still we have heard nothing about them. So that's a slightly negative way to open, so let's start with something slightly positive. One of the 3 key main recommendations was mandatory reporting. We have asked you all for questions, and we've had lots of questions about this, so we will start there. But before we do that, I will introduce you to our fantastic panel. We have Alexis Jay, Professor Alexis Jay, who obviously needs very little introduction. She was the chair of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. She is joining us. Thank you, Alexis, for taking time out. She's in France, very hot, I hear. So thank you, Alexis. David Greenwood, who is the director of Swatowski's solicitors and was an expert witness to the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And John O'Brien, the CEO, the secretary to the inquiry. So thank you all very much for joining us. As I said, we're going to start with mandatory reporting. There's been lots of controversy over this, people panicking that it means that you're going to have to report anything you see. You're going to have to report your neighbour if you suspect something, and that's not the case at all. David, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, thank you. So, mandatory reporting, it is what it says in the tin, I suppose, but before I start, I really want to put this into context. The IICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, undertook 13 inquiries, and running through all of them, one of the main conclusions, probably the main conclusion that came through from all the inquiries, was that some form of mandatory reporting into the police and local authority that a person is suspected of abusing a child would have stopped future rapes of children. In every inquiry that I sat through and worked in, that's the main conclusion that came out. So it's no surprise that that was one of the main recommendations of the final report. So it's really important. There's been some panic, as Lucy mentioned, about how far is this applied, who has to do it. Well, it's restricted in some new legislation on Section 66 of this Crime and Policing Bill that's currently going through Parliament and is probably likely to become law towards the end of this year or early next year, when all the wrangling over the very many sections is sorted out. It applies to what's called regulated activity, which is restricted basically to teachers, healthcare workers, professionals working with children.
School clubs as well.
Yeah.
And so it's important, I think there's lots of like scouts and brownies and those sorts of clubs where we know a lot of abuse has gone on, and lots of people have just said we don't need to look in that area.
Yeah, it's good to organised activities where children are looked after, either casually in these after-school clubs, etc., or in residential care. That's who it applies to. It doesn't apply to everybody, and the requirement is that a person must, if they suspect that abuse is or has taken place, they must notify the police or the local authority of their suspicion. There is an exception for a person who sees or thinks that consensual sexual activity is taking place between children aged between 13 and 18. That's going to be a hot topic when it comes to be debated, I think. But there is a safeguard in there that a reasonable person has to suspect that harm will come to one of those children. So that's kind of a safeguard that's built in there. There is no offence committed if you don't report. It's just a requirement of the legislation. It basically gives you a statutory duty to do it. You're not committing an offence if you don't. I think the beauty of the legislation is that if you don't, your employer, who is likely to be a government organisation or some kind of heavily centralised organisation, is likely to take disciplinary action against you, and that's probably going to be the sanction for not reporting. So I think the government's balance on this is right. We don't want thousands of people having to be dragged through the courts. That would really clog the system up. So I think they've got it right on this. There is an offence of obstructing someone who should be making a report. For instance, say I work for a scout association. I'm a scout leader. I have a boss, and I think something bad is happening. I want to report it, and my boss tells me, no, you can't do that. You can't report that. It's going to harm our organisation. My boss would get convicted of an offence if that were found out. So that's good.
There's been a lot of criticism about the fact that it doesn't automatically provide a criminal sanction. So if you don't report, you don't get prosecuted and tried in a court. And that's been a lot of the criticism. I suppose certainly from our point of view, we know the state the criminal justice system is in at the moment, and we know that actually we're not managing to prosecute the people who are causing the sexual violence and the rape and the child abuse at the moment. I don't think right now we need something in place that is that's going to serve to better change a culture and support staff as well. So as the example David just gave, if you said, well, my boss says I can't report it, now it's actually going to be supportive. This isn't there to try and put more people in prison. It's to try and change a culture and make it more supportive and make it more black and white as to where we go with it. But I suppose that has been the biggest, and that's slightly the change from what IICSA was suggesting. Alexis, sorry. Yes, and then I'll go to Alexis.
It's true to say that there isn't a criminal offence for somebody who suspects that abuse has taken place would go through the criminal justice system, but there is provision in the bill that if they don't report and people around them or their employer thinks that might be something that was done for the wrong reasons, they can be referred into they must be referred into the Disclosure and Barring Service to consider barring. Now, lots of people have said to me, but that doesn't mean anything. If you're barred, you can't work with children in regulated activity in any circumstances. And if the DBS suspect that the reason for it is really nefarious, they could put you on both the children's and the adults barred list, because when you're referred in, they can consider you for both. So I do think that's a real deterrent, and I think it's the right deterrent. I know that's controversial. If the introduction of mandatory reporting ends up with thousands of people being prosecuted, we've got the balance wrong. We want people to feel supported to make those reports, not worry that the only reason they should make a report is they're going to be sent to prison if they don't. We want them to consider the balances in the Act. The thing that David talked about, the 13 to 18-year-olds, is there for a reason. Now, we can all dispute, should the difference in age be 3 years or 5 years, but the reason it's there is that we have to accept consensual relationships do take place between people at the upper end of the legal definition of children. And what you don't want to do is create an environment where they won't access the services they need to access because they're worried that would lead to a report that the elder is abusing the younger. Now, there's all sorts of protections in the Act that they must both be mentally capable of making that decision. Somebody can't just decide, or they've told me they are. If you read the Act, there are a number of provisions they have to go through to make sure that's the case. So I do think that on balance, it's a very good way to encourage people to report rather than criminalise people for not reporting, and it's the first that we want. But I just wanted to pick up on one final thing that David said about the criminal offence that is in the Act, which is that if you are a senior manager or the owner of a business and you deliberately try to prevent somebody from reporting, you can be sent to prison for up to 7 years. The most common thing we heard in evidence in the inquiry and in the Truth Project was that as soon as an organisation knew that it had an abuser in its ranks, it closed ranks, didn't make the correct reports to the police, didn't make the correct reports to social services. And certainly in the Truth Project sessions I sat into, that was the most common reason why those brave victims and survivors who come and talk to us felt that their abuse had gone on for so long, because the right authorities hadn't been told and therefore couldn't make the right intervention at the right point. And so I think that is really telling. So there were 3 common themes that emerged across nearly all organisations that come to talk to us in IICSA, but that was by far the one that people talked about why their abuse continued when, frankly, it should have been stopped much, much earlier, because the police or the social services or somebody else should have been told about it.
Great, thank you, John. Alexis, is there anything you want to add about mandatory reporting before I move on to any of the others?
Just one brief point. One of the major concerns we heard about especially from professionals who are engaged in addressing child sexual abuse, and local authorities and police, was the major concern that emerged from previous government consultations on the subject matter, was about how the authorities would be inundated with false reports at certain times, and therefore already hard-pressed social workers and police might be unable to cope with the numbers. Now, we did an enormous amount of research at an international level, as well as more locally, on mandatory reporting, where it was implemented in different places. And whilst there was indeed an immediate uplift, if you like, in the number of referrals for various forms of child protection, not just child sexual abuse, after a certain period of time, which was usually around 18 months perhaps, as an average, the persons concerned, once it was researched, were able to say that the increase in actual cases of child abuse that had been referred to them was significant. I think in the state of, I mean, it was Victoria in Australia, it was put at 28%.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you. One of the questions we've just had come through is why is there no press on this, and why is the government not talking more about mandatory reporting? I mean, I'd love to know that. Does anyone want to answer that? Because we can't really. I think one of the themes today will be very much that we really do hope the government improve their messaging on this, even if they're not able to do something. You know, survivors have been lied to for decades, and actually honesty and truth and transparency is something that we are all calling for. So the government would be very welcome if they could start making more accurate and regular announcements on this. Okay, I know mandatory reporting is a big one, but we do need to move on. Our other one, which Act on IICSA has been really campaigning for as the main issue, we very much believe that if this is in place as IICSA intended, we would then be able to address the other recommendations, is our Child Protection Authority. We were recently reassured that that was going to happen as part of the Department for Education's remit. I will stop there and hand over to John.
So just a very brief background. The reason that there was a Child Protection Authority recommendation is because there was overwhelming evidence that when people talked to us, there were so many organisations that were responsible for so many different bits of the chain of child protection that things were falling between the gaps. So if you look at Ofsted, very small madrasas and things fell outside the scope of their remit. So there were lots of gaps where things weren't happening because it wasn't clear who, if anybody, of the official body should be looking at that. And when you heard the amount of evidence that Alexis has just referred to, those small gaps suddenly became a great big gap when you looked at how often they were happening in all the different sectors. So the whole point of the CPA is to give one organisation with a singular focus, which is the protection of children, which is not to decry at all what Ofsted and CQC and all those other organisations do, but it is not their singular focus. It is a bit of a much larger focus when Ofsted or CQC or any of the other inspectorates go in. And so they have a limited amount of time to place the emphasis on child protection. It became very clear during the inquiry we need an organisation with a singular focus. So that was the whole purpose of the CPA. And our vision was very much that it would be more along the lines of the Health and Safety Executive, where it helps, encourages and assists organisations to get better at this, but has teeth behind that to come in where, despite that help and assistance, organisations persistently fail to improve their protection of children. So that was the vision behind it. It's a big vision, and it will require a significant piece of primary legislation. So in discussions with the current government, which started not soon after they came into power, the Department for Education thought that a way to kickstart that would be to build it around the current Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. And the reason for that, because what that panel does will need to form a part of what the CPA does when it's up and running as a fully fledged organisation. So to give it a start with something that already had legislation around it, it was agreed to build it around that. We had really promising early conversations with the Department for Education, where they said they understood that it would need to be a very different beast. I think Alexis, who will probably want to come into this, will say she was very clear, and she was very clear that you can use that as a starting point, but the end point is very different, and we were only agreeing to that on the basis that everybody agreed that the end point was very different. It wasn't that panel with a few extra bits wrapped on, if I can put it like that. And so there was a promising conversation about that. During that conversation, we talked about the fact that there were a significant number of roles on that panel coming up for renewal this year, and a good starting point for the government to really underline their commitment to us would be to work with us to think about what different skill sets might go in the adverts for those panel members, accepting that it has to do its day job, but what different skills could be looked for when you were recruiting to help the journey from where it is now to where it needs to be, so that there was something tangible that we could see that made us knew we were going to get there. I think it's very disappointing to say that the adverts went out very recently with no referral or conversation with whether that was about to happen, and they are identical in all respects to the last time they were advertised, and there wasn't one mention in any of the advertisements that the ambition was to turn the organisation into the CPA eventually. And there was also at that meeting a conversation about working with us to think about what the future legislative steps might be. What legislation does the government need to lay to get it from here to there? And there's been dead silence on that. There has been no further contact with DFE or any other government department about what those steps might look like. So I have to say, sitting here right now, that the government will say there's still a commitment to it, and I'm sure that they're not lying in that. But we've had commitment so often. We need more than commitment now. If we're going to all be confident that there is going to CPA that is there to better protect children going forward, we need to see what is the plan that starts when you started to talk about this in March of this year in detail. What is the plan that gets us to the fully fledged CPA? And the end point of that plan needs to contain the vision of what the CPA will actually do and what powers it will actually have. Because without that, it is all talk. And so my view at the moment is I'm sure there is a commitment, but we now need a solid action plan. We need engagement with us and with others, with people from the wider sector, to talk about what that should look like so that we end up with a CPA that's fit for purpose.
Thank you, John. I don't think that could be a clearer message. Alexis, Child Protection Authority,
Yes.
Current government, what's going on based on, John was very clear there that it's not fast enough and it's not adequate enough what is being done currently, and that's very disappointing after the many conversations that we have had with them. What are your thoughts?
Well, John correctly stated my position when first asked, if you like, to support the idea of the National Practice Review Panel being the basis for the CPA. And I was absolutely clear that my support was conditional upon this model looking and, more importantly, being significantly different from the Practice Review Panel, not because those involved with it have done anything but a perfectly decent job. That is the case, and you'd still almost certainly have the scope for having such activity being absorbed into a CPA. but we're still waiting to see what the plan is for how we get from where we are to where we need to be in order to radically change the child protection system. And we need to get that plan soon in order to fit any kind of reasonable timescale for implementation.
So
none of this is easy.
no, I understand. If they carry on as they are, saying, well, we've got a child protection authority because we're going to hook it on the back of this panel, what I'm hearing is Act on IICSA's position is that's not the CPA as we intended, and therefore we don't support it. We won't accept that that is one of the recommendations that's been implemented. Am I right in saying that, or is it too early to say that?
Oh, I think there's scope for retrieving this, of course, yeah. But it just has to move much faster and be. We need to hear clearly that the CPA will be different and must be demonstrated in the transition from the current National Practice Review Panel into the CPA, and how that's to happen, and how clear they will be about its functions in order to deliver the model that my inquiry spent a great deal of time thinking through and ultimately making that recommendation. But we need to see action pretty soon.
So I mentioned that this is going to require a significant piece of primary legislation, and we all know how long that takes from the date that it's laid in Parliament. So it's no good saying we're going to take all these preliminary steps and it'll be 2 years before we write the legislation. You need to be doing them both together so that you lay the legislation as early as you can and limit the period they're required to bring this in to the smallest possible period at all. For me, the reason the CPA is so important, there is no doubt that the only way you'll get significant change in the protection of children in any society, Britain included, is with radical culture change about the way we think about it and the way we implement the way we protect children. And that is the thing that the CPA was a major part of how we designed culture change into our recommendations. And it needs to happen as soon as it possibly can.
The whole point of the CPA is to not only spread good practice among all organisations that supervise the looking after of children, but to standardise that good practice. At the moment, we've got all sorts of different organisations applying different rules, different guidance, and it's not necessarily good guidance. We've also heard in the news just recently that data sets are not up to scratch. The CPA could do that work. It could bring in specialists to make sure that all organisations are required to gather this evidence, this data, so that, you know, if we started today, in 3 years' time, we could have a really lovely data set and be able to target resources on, you know, stamping out, you know, perpetrators and improving practice in safeguarding.
Thank you. That I can see some great questions coming in as well, and some on mandatory reporting as well. We will get to all of them at the end. Someone has said, which one is more important? I think everyone here is in agreement that the plan was that all of these recommendations would be implemented together as a package. When we realised that that wasn't going to happen, the final report of IICSA was published on the day that Liz Truss resigned, so it did not get the media attention it deserved. And I think, well, I don't know, but I'm suggesting that perhaps that might have been in some government's favour, because they didn't have the public pressure that they should have had to make sure that this happened. We realised that this wasn't going to happen as quickly as it should do, and so that's why we got behind the CPA. Obviously, our envisage is that the CPA would help implement all the other recommendations, but there is no one that is particularly more important. We need them all now. It's not us that need them, it's our children. And I think nobody's in disagreement that we urgently need child protection reform and reform for adult survivors, of which there are currently about 14 million in this country, and not one government department is adequately funding those services. So there is reform needed, but we want all of these as a package to be implemented. Thank you. David, do you want to move on to talk briefly about redress, please?
Redress, thank you, yeah. That's great.
Can you hold your microphone properly, please?
Right, sorry, right. Yeah, so just speaking informally to a couple of colleagues, legal colleagues, reflecting about what we heard in the IICSA inquiries, particularly in the accountability and reparations module. What ran through that was that out of the people that come to lawyers, and that's probably a minority of people who have been sexually abused in childhood, we probably turn away 2/3 of the people that come to us because of either problems with the law on limitation, and I know that there's been some indication that the government would accept that an amendment to sweep away the law on limitation, but we haven't seen anything yet. So the law on limitation, the time limits, is a problem. That stops people getting some kind of redress or compensation. There are problems with vicarious liability. Is an organisation responsible for an employee working for it in certain circumstances? And there are lots of arguments around that. There are arguments about the type of abuse that has happened, and all these prevent, we think, 2/3 of people who come to us from getting any kind of redress. So a recommendation came through from the IICSA in its final report that a national redress system should be set up. Now we have some redress systems ad hoc going through every now and then. There's the Lambeth scheme, there is the Manchester City scheme, there's a Northern Ireland scheme at the moment. All these are variations on a theme, but there are lots of people out there who have suffered child sexual abuse and who have no recourse to any kind of redress, compensation, payment so that they can access therapy and get themselves back on their feet. And we think that's, the IICSA obviously agreed that that's a gap. So the redress scheme is a major part of rehabilitation and assisting those that have been affected by all this. We think that the government should commit to this. Now there are various models of that. There are ways in which it can be made not as expensive as a Rolls-Royce or singing or dancing model, but we need to see one selected, and we need to see the government talking to us and, well, holding a consultation on it. If someone, government minister, would put a few of us lawyers who know about this in a room and design one, we could hammer one out in 2 or 3 days, which would be acceptable. So please come and talk to us, government.
David, can you just explain, just really simple terms, what's the difference if you're saying you want a redress scheme, but then you're saying there's one in Lambeth or there's one, so can you just explain the difference, obviously?
Yeah, the current schemes that are in force around the country are very, very narrow, either confined to the Lambeth scheme, is confined to children who are in local authority care or abused in local authority care homes in the Lambeth Council area. The Manchester City scheme is confined to children who were abused whilst under the supervision of people who were working for Manchester City. These are very, very narrow schemes. A redress scheme, a national redress scheme, would be open to anybody who is sexually abused in childhood.
Thank you. Alexis, is there anything you want to add on?
I think in the inquiry, we felt there was a strong moral responsibility of all of the institutions that we scrutinised to offer comprehensive redress areas. Especially, redress doesn't just amount to funding alone, of course. It refers to services and support, apology, and a range of what I personally see as comprehensive. So we need to ensure that some of those areas are properly addressed to, as David said, assist in any transitions and help that can be given to the many victims and survivors, either as children or adults. And I do strongly believe it must be a moral responsibility on everybody. We know that many institutions have taken a long time to even talk about this issue, whilst they have known about the sexual abuse of children who they came into contact with, and have known about it for decades, and nothing has been done.
From my perspective, I've worked in this field ever since I started work as a solicitor, and the harm that's done to victims of child sexual abuse is incalculable. It's not only to them, but also to the wider society, and the people not working, being out of work, and not being productive, all that, so that makes me feel that this is a very deserving segment that needs looking at and assisting in any way possible. But I see other areas being having schemes set up, such as the post office, such as infected blood, and I see not that there's a hierarchy, but I don't see why child sexual abuse victims should not have a scheme set up to compensate them or to assist them.
Thank you. I think, and again, that's something that's come up a lot this week, hasn't it? Is I think we always do that with this subject. Is we talk a lot about either who the perpetrators are or where the abuse has happened. My theory for that is the other end, because then that means it can't happen to us or our children because we don't go to that school or we're not there. And there is no hierarchy of suffering or outcomes when it comes to this subject. It's devastating. It's preventable. It needs to stop. This new government are now 10 months into their administration, and I'm just looking through this list now, and it's actually really depressing because we've got 5 amber. The 3 greens that we can say are going to be implemented were actually put in place a year ago, and they're bills that have already gone through Parliament. So we're not going to go through them all literally individually. If you wanted to, do shout, but just because they speak for themselves. Cabinet Minister for Children, the fact that we don't have anybody sitting on the front bench representing our children, I think it's an absolute travesty. Speaking as a mother, as a former teacher, and now as somebody working in prevention, I think that's just appalling. There's been absolutely no comment on that at all. A public awareness campaign, that doesn't need any legislation. We all know we need to change the culture. We can just be getting on with that. There's lots here, and you've got the list in front of you that you can see. I think one of the ones that lots of people have said to me is they're quite surprised about, and Alexis, I'd like to ask you about this, is pain compliance to be outlawed. Could you just explain to us what that means and what's happening now? And where we're at with that, please.
Well, this was one of our recommendations that derived from children in custodial institutions, that particular investigation area, and we're talking about under 18-year-olds in certain training centres and other forms of custodial care, including within social services. And we were appalled to see that the guidance that was available to staff working in those, if you like, centrally controlled custodial settings allowed for the use of what is called pain compliance techniques. Now that effectively means, for example, the bending back of fingers or the hand and various other forms of physical contact with under 18-year-olds where they are used in order to contain the person's potential or actual risk to others or themselves in certain circumstances. And I think we described it as state-sponsored child abuse. And we thought that in this day and age it must be stopped immediately.
And let's be really clear, these are children who have already extremely vulnerable because they're in a residential setting. They might well have already experienced abuse, and the people in their care are legally able to cause them pain. What have the government said on that one, John?
So, I mean, there's dead silence, really.
Yeah.
I think is the right way to put it. I think they're not keen on doing it. I think what's worth thinking about is if you think about what has happened with legislation about what parents are allowed to do with their children in terms to get them to behave. If this happened in the home, it wouldn't be allowed. And yet, as Alexis says, it seems to be allowed and acceptable if it happens at state level. And I understand all the arguments that are being put out by government and others, that it's only ever used as a last resort. There's all sorts of guidance out there that contains its use, all of those things. But they're all a smokescreen for we allow something to happen in state institutions that we wouldn't allow to happen, parents to use as a way to make children behave in their home. Now, if parents can make children behave in their home without using these techniques, why can't we transplant that into state institutions rather than the other way round? So I think for me, this is one of those where it's on the back burner. It's not been explicitly rejected, but there's been almost nothing about acceptance. So I think this is one we need to press on, because I think the likelihood is it may well be properly, formally rejected if we're not careful.
Bit of disagreement here. I thought it had been rejected.
I think it has been rejected, John.
Has it?
Yeah.
Well, there we
Okay,
go.
so
Okay.
Along with the improvements to the criminal injuries compensation scheme.
I raise this one anyway, because if you look at, so this is pain compliance to be outlawed. So we're in a situation where children who are vulnerable and being detained in a setting of some kind are being looked after by staff who are legally allowed to cause them physical pain. And if you go down, we're also in a situation where staff who work in those institutions do not need to be registered. So this is why I think Alexis came to the conclusion that this is legalised child abuse. We are recruiting adults without checking their background or registering them. Oh, sorry, maybe not checking their background, but without registering them. And we are then training them to cause pain to vulnerable children who, by the nature of where they are much less likely to be believed and do not have any guardians advocating for them. This has been the case for many years. This was highlighted 2.5 years ago. And as John just said, there is complete silence from the government on this. So, yeah, I suppose not much more to...
I'm dredging my memory, but I think from memory that we were told the government are looking at what alternatives might be available. But I can't imagine that the alternative... If you're looking at alternatives, it's got to be... You're not accepting this shouldn't happen at all. You're looking for a way that you can use something different that you wouldn't necessarily use in your home. So I really worry about this one. And I do remember very early on in the inquiry having a conversation with the then Inspector of Prisons who took the opposite view. And I'm sorry to say that all of the arguments that are trotted out about, but what you've got is this is not applicable as it would be in the home, because you've got a lot of people that are actually in a young offenders institute, but actually what you're doing is you're teaching those people in that young offenders institute that using pain is a way to get people to do what you want, and I'm not sure that's what we want people who are in young offenders institutions to come away with as a life learning experience.
Thank you.
Sorry, could I just say something very briefly? We did encounter in the inquiry victims who were a little older, who I hope it doesn't happen now, I'm sure perhaps it doesn't, but had been more put into a custodial setting for like stealing a bar of chocolate and not anything else for, I think, up to 3 years. And that was terrible. And those people, just referring back to redress, will perhaps never be compensated for that kind of treatment that they had. And certainly restraint techniques that are do not use pain are commonly used in children's homes and elsewhere, properly trained. You can restrain in certain circumstances certain techniques that are not pain-inducing. So it's not as if this is that difficult to find alternatives to.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. We're going to go to more questions in a minute. There are questions coming through. I know from the work we do at Survivors Trust, one of the other ones that lots of people talk about, and that's on Amber, is gaining access to records. This is adult survivors trying to understand what has happened to them, trying to piece together their past, understandably, and see who knew what in the age of pre-mandatory reporting. We know that when it can take many years for them to get those records from social services, from the institutions, and then when they do receive it, they are heavily redacted and they can feel silenced all over again. So one of the recommendations was that all victims of abuse will have a right to have the access to records. Who wants to? David, do you want to take that? Where are we at with it? Go on, then.
So on this one, it was part of the conversation that Alexis and I had with government officials earlier this year. And the solution that the government proposed to us, which would not be a bad solution if it were to be implemented, was that there's a bill going through Parliament that allows the government ministers to direct the Information Commissioner to issue new guidance if they think there's guidance needed in the area which the Information Commissioner has remit over. And they suggested that would be a good way to do this. And the reason, Alexis, I think that's a good idea, is a lot of the reasons that people are given for this is to do with data protection. And so if you've got a really clear guidance from the Data Protection Registrar about what is a record, we need to understand what is a record of child abuse. And I'll just come back to that very briefly in a moment. But having got a record of child abuse and defined it as a record of child abuse, then they would issue guidance that would determine a number of things, including how long organisations should keep those records. Now, we need to be clear, it wouldn't be legally binding, but there are lots of things that the Information Commissioner and other organisations like him do where guidance is a very good answer to the question that you've been asked. So that seemed like a good way forward. We were told, we then had a meeting with the Information Commissioner and some of his staff themselves, and that again has gone silent. So it's one of the ones we're chasing to say, where has this got to? We were promised that we'll be able to be consulted on what that guidance from the Information Commissioner should look like and what it should contain, so that we, as far as possible, made it gel with what Alexis said in her report. So it is not a bad solution. It may be not the optimal solution, but it's not a bad solution. It can be in place far, far more quickly than government bringing new laws about this. But again, it's stalled. Can I just say one more thing off subject about the Children's Minister? And, you know, I won't talk about what IICSA said about a Children's Minister. I think it's self-explanatory. And it was very specific, a Children's Minister at Cabinet level. So not somebody with the title Children's Minister, but somebody sits around the cabinet table when all those big early discussions about who gets what's money, what are the government priorities, all those sorts of things, there is a voice around the table that does that for children. And I'm going to paraphrase something that Baroness Casey said at HASC, and I apologise to her in advance for the paraphrasing, but it was when she was talking about data and saying, what I'm saying about data and the lack of it is not new. You know, it was said by Alexis in Rotherham, it was said by Alexis in IICSA, it's been said by others since. But nobody in government seemed to be focused on it. Well, what about a children's minister who could focus on it? So, you know, it just struck me yesterday, we're hearing another thing that to me said what you need is somebody whose sole job is to concentrate on things like this, and who perhaps would have taken note of all those reports coming from various places and thinking, actually, this is my job. So,
thank you. One of the questions we've got going back to mandatory reporting is, can you tell me how this will work for therapists who are working with perpetrators? Who wants to take that one? Go on.
It really depends on whether they are in a regulated activity.
Right.
There's
If it's a perpetrator says, I'm abusing somebody and I'm in the Scouts, for instance.
Yeah.
But if they're in the family.
If you're in not in a regulated activity, and it strikes me that therapists, self-employed therapists, working for themselves are not regulated. So there probably wouldn't be an obligation on them to report.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
It also covers positions of trust, which is important to say, because it does cover people who aren't necessarily directly providing care, support or education to children directly, but are in a position to influence how that is done in an organisation. So priests are a good example of it. Some priests might never have direct contact with children. They might not run Sunday schools, or they might be in a theological institution where they influence the policy that's coming out in a particular region. Those positions are all covered in mandatory reporting.
Thank you. If anyone in the room has any questions as well, pop your hand up, but I will keep going. I'll come to you in one second, Peter. One of the other things we've had through is a lot about statistics. We often use statistics, but it does depend how we look at them. And I think to that, a lot of it is we don't know how many survivors are there, what are their ethnicity, who is creating this crime, why aren't institutions reporting, how many institutions are there. The reason we don't know is because we're not keeping the data. And the reason we're not keeping the data is because we have not adhered to one of IICSA's recommendations, which was for a national core data set. I hope that's fair, unless anyone wants to say anything. Alexis, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I know people think it's a somewhat nerdy subject, but it is so important to so many aspects of our understanding, in our case, of child sexual abuse and how to address it in the future. We need to know the nature and scale of the problem, and we cannot do that without ensuring that everybody applies uses the same categorization rather than applies it, but uses the same categorization with the same meaning for all across the country, in England and Wales, and I would argue possibly in the UK, but that's perhaps asking for too much. But it is absolutely necessary that we have reliable data sets on which to plan for services, give a better understanding of the scale and the type of abuse that is happening, and of course also about the perpetrators. And we very strongly argued for this from the beginning. We've heard a lot about it this week, but it is one of those, if you like, nothing new recommendations that we've been talking about for years and years and years and years. And it causes other problems. For example, when people move from one area to another, or children are trafficked from one area to another, their access to services, if they come into contact with the local authority or the police, is hampered because everyone interprets the limited amount of data collection there is differently, and it can actually cause real problems because of the criteria applied for access to certain services.
One statistic we are all that can't be disputed is that 500,000 children experience uniquely sexual abuse every single year. It's been 1,000 days since the end of the inquiry. Only 3 recommendations since the inquiry started. That's over 4 million children that have experienced childhood sexual abuse. So I think we can say the time for any more consultations or discussions is over. We know what we need to do. Thank you, Peter.
Hi. I've got 2 points and 1 question, so I'll just, up to you. Yeah. First question is about the redress scheme. 9th of April, a paper came out from the Home Office saying we're definitely not going ahead with the redress scheme. Then Jess Phillips said in Parliament, well, we might be, but we'll wait for the next funding review. The funding review came out. I listened to it, nothing. So do we know what the current state of affairs is? Because I got a story on Sky News and they got a very angry email from Yvette Cooper about the redress scheme not coming in, though I don't know what the angry email said, so I'm a bit confused. Second point was CICA scheme, 9th of April, response from government, we're not making any changes at all, we don't care, thank you very much, great as it is, and we don't want to overburden the police with too much work, thank you very much. Make sure that I thought was pretty horrendous and really scandalous. Third point, on access to care records, I'm a member of the Access to Care Records campaign group. We are in contact with the Information Commissioner's Office, who have, for the last 12 months at least, had a project to bring in guidance, just as an update on that. So something is happening, though we're not quite clear what's going to happen yet. That's underway.
Thank you. We've only got about 3 minutes left. So, David, obviously there was a spending review very recently. I know everyone in the sector was watching with bated breath, hoping that some extra funding would be announced. Our sector and this issue wasn't mentioned once, but we don't have too long to go into this. David, do you want to address some of those points?
So on the redress, I'm still waiting for someone to break down the spending review, if we get any detail from it as to what it means to redress. There are ways in which the cost of redress can be curtailed if we follow an Australian model, which is to make the polluter pay, so to speak, to make sure that these organisations whose employees have been abusing pay back into the public purse. So that's a way of keeping the cost down, but I really don't know what's been allocated in the spending review yet.
Great. Thank you. Do you want to add anything, John?
No, I mean, you asked what the status was. I think it's in the long grass. They definitely haven't said no, but they haven't indicated anything other than that.
Okay. Before we end, I'm being a bit of a geek. I counted up how many times both Jess Phillips and Yvette Cooper have committed to implementing the recommendations in full since January, and together that is 7 in public. Alexis, do you have faith that this government's going to implement all 20 recommendations as you intended?
I think I would have to qualify a response there as I intended. Because I doubt whether that will happen in the detail that we went into for the purposes of the inquiry. I do have some confidence that perhaps things will move on now. I hope there are no distractions, and it is very important that we get the key recommendations implemented, and ultimately, of course, all of them. And I would hope to see some signs for optimism and a bit more speed and progress to be evident, but at the moment it feels a little in limbo.
Final words? What would you like to see happen?
So my final words were, all of us sat in a room a year ago, really enthusiastic, that when we did this, well, that we might not need to do this again. And here we are, and we can only tell you about 3 things that are actually in legislation. And I think, I'm going to use the words very disappointing, because I'm polite, but I think it's very disappointing.
And my summation is that, as John complains, we've been led up the garden path, and we're not getting through the front door, basically. It seems to me that the government on this lacks leadership. Someone really needs to get to grip of it and make it happen.
Thank you. We're out of time, so I just want to thank everyone for coming and helping us have this discussion today. It very clearly does not end here. If anybody does want to get in touch and support us, you can find our details on the link that you're watching or via our website. We will continue with Act on IICSA. We're obviously very passionate about making sure that all these recommendations are implemented alongside the work we do to support adult survivors, many of whom will be, again, really impacted by the news this week, might be watching this and wanting to realise that they're not alone and things are being done in this area. Do please reach out, go on our website. There are lots of support services available to you. We work with over 150,000 survivors every year through our member agencies. We know that survivors need specialist support, not statutory services, and we know that that support needs to be funded, and will always relentlessly continue to fight for that. Thank you very much, and thank you, Alexis, for taking time out while you're abroad to join us. This certainly won't be the end of the conversation, and we're really grateful for all of you and your interest. Many people choose not to engage with such a difficult subject, and of course the victims don't have that choice. So thank you very much for coming today, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.